Good afternoon. It will come as little surprise to those of you who've seen me give talks before that I really don't consider myself an optimist, especially when it comes to human-caused climate disruption. I've been paying close attention to the ongoing and emerging consequences of global warming for over 20 years now, and each year seems to be worse than the last. But somehow, I still have hope. The art here is Picasso's Dove with Sun from 1962. It's not his best known work, but the image has stuck with me since I saw it in person in Chile about a decade ago, a nation at the time still dealing with the after effects of dictatorship. Picasso drew dozens upon dozens of doves of peace over the years. But what leaps out at me, and possibly to you, is that the dove nests on a pile of weapons. Guns, cannons, swords. As far as I can find, it's unique among his dove lithographs. This drawing reminds me that peace isn't a condition, it's a choice. Peace doesn't pretend that weapons never existed, but acknowledges that we have to intentionally put them down. And that's hard, but not impossible. A failure to achieve peace doesn't mean that it's unattainable, but that we need to do more, that we can still change our path. So when I say that I still have hope about the climate and our collective futures, it's not the hope of everything will be fine. It's a hope that comes from knowing that we can still change our path. That success remains possible, but success at this scale doesn't just come from waiting for it. Success will require a revolution. Evolution won't be enough. It's not an impossible revolution. We have the tools, the technologies and methods that we need to resolve the onrushing climate disaster. We know what we need to do, and we know that we can do it. There isn't a giant mystery left to be solved. And increasingly, we recognize that we must do it. The only people left who want to push action off for another decade are those trying to wring the last pennies out of the fossil fuel economy. We know what we need to do. We know that we can do it, and we know that we must do it. The remaining question is whether we can get it done in time. We needed to start working on this in the 1960s. We really needed to get going by the 1990s. We're running very, very late. The choices we're making right now will decide what kind of world we'll have in a generation, in 2050. And to be brutally honest, the challenge we face is immense, staggering even. It's something at a scale that humankind hasn't had to deal with in at least 70,000 years. That's when the Toba supervolcano erupted. Some scientists argue that it nearly wiped out early Homo sapiens. These days, simply continuing on as we have will leave major parts of the world uninhabitable, with dire consequences for the rest of it. Look at the map, the big map there. It's from a 2020 article in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. The article was The Future of the Human Climate Niche. Every place shown in orange or red gets less suitable for human society over the next 50 years. That's most of the United States, China, and Brazil, pretty much all of India. And according to the authors, with a business as usual scenario, in 50 years, 1/3 of the world's population would face temperature averages akin to today's Sahara Desert. Even if some places do become better suited, think of the implications of all of that for water access, food access, climate, politics, migration, politics, war. And this is just one example of the thousands of different scary images and graphs I could show you. But that's not what I'm here to do today. Foresight specialists like to think in terms of scenarios, and there's a scenario building tool we use frequently in Institute projects, the University of Hawaii Scenario Archetype Approach. Its creator, Professor Jim Dator, postulates that there are ultimately 4 different archetypical scenario narratives. Growth, which is often assumed to mean better, but really should be thought of as more. More of whatever the scenarios focus on, water, money, even pandemic diseases. But most of the time, the scenario is where things are more or less working as intended. Constraint, a scenario of limitations, but not elimination. It could be a tighten your belt scenario, a heavy regulation scenario, even a stop making things worse scenario. It's typically used as a dealing with setbacks future. Collapse, which mirroring growth is often explained as worse, but really is akin to much less, approaching zero. It usually shows up as economic collapse or social collapse, but it could also be infection rates collapse or Infection rates go up and the Martian armies collapse. That said, in most cases, the collapse scenarios are typically the ones we don't want. And then there's transformation, where everything is different. Not necessarily better, not necessarily worse, but always radically divergent from where our normal paths would lead. Weirder, at least from a present day viewpoint. Okay, great. We apply these to climate futures, we get a good one, an okay one, a weird one, and one bad one, right? Right? Yeah, not so much. Because the reality of what we face is a lot more complex than that. Trying to grow our way out of climate disaster, best summed up, I think, by the one guy who tried to tell me, after the singularity, we won't have to worry about global warming, so we just need to make sure the singularity happens soon. Trying to grow our way out with newer and newer technology is actually more likely to make things much worse. In large measure, this is because how we do growth is what got us into trouble in the first place. Most of our conventional means of growth are based on the practices developed in the carbon economy. Growth is tightly linked to concepts of economic efficiency, quick return on investment, and just-in-time, high-frequency moves. It's a system that can make you rich when things are fine, but can shatter quite spectacularly when something goes wrong. Taking the growth pathway is likely to be a spectacular variation on collapse. In a similar way, constraint may slow collapse, but it probably won't avoid it. Trying to regulate ourselves out of climate disaster will be extremely difficult at best, as we know very well that relentless compromises, backsliding, cheating, hesitancy will endanger our ability to do enough and to do it fast enough. In the real world, it's too easy to blame competitors or shareholders or citizens. Collapse is, well, still collapse. But in this context, we could see it as the scenario where we just stop caring or even trying. Extra collapsy collapse. And maybe the super intelligent raccoons or tool-using octopus of the post-Anthropocene will get it right. So that leaves us with transformation. It's become painfully, unavoidably clear to me that this is the only scenario type likely to show us a successful future. Transformation is the only one left standing because, to put it bluntly, moderation is no longer enough. We are well past the point of being able to successfully beat back climate disaster by making careful socioeconomic and technological changes. The glaciers are already disappearing. Wildland fires are already becoming uncontrollable. The scale and the speed of change that's needed is not friendly to careful deliberation. If a green transition deadline is seen as politically feasible, it's almost certainly too late. We have to act far more rapidly than we would wish. And by 2050, less than 30 years, this die will have been cast. It's critical to make clear just how fundamental this is. We are already going to experience terrible consequences of global warming in the coming years, regardless of what we do. The goal at this point is to avoid a total global catastrophe. I'm sorry. This is supposed to be a hopeful talk. So let's talk transformation. Call it the 2050 transformation. For many of us, when we imagine a transformation scenario, the first thing that comes to mind is technology. Or, I'm sorry, I mean technology. And there's absolutely no question that successfully confronting climate catastrophe will require the adoption of a wide array of often very disruptive technologies. Some of the changes are well underway. Wind turbines have become nearly ubiquitous, and solar power is now, on average, the least expensive form of electricity generation on the planet. We're moving off of carbon energy far more swiftly than any of the mainstream experts predicted. I remember having conversations with oil industry executives about a decade ago, where they were adamant that solar and wind wouldn't be able to compete with oil and gas for at least 50 years. I wonder if they remember those conversations. There's plenty of infrastructure work left to do, and different parts of the world are changing at different speeds, but I remain pretty confident that the transition to zero carbon energy will happen well ahead of expectations. A similar case can be made for clean mobility. Again, the transition is happening more quickly than once thought possible and will almost certainly continue to accelerate as costs plummet, and we see new battery technologies, higher density, faster charging. The move to electric vehicles will be part of it, but the transformation will also come with the re-envisioning of how mobility fits into our lives. And that will be part of the transformation of urban and peri-urban communities. Now, that kind of infrastructure change will take longer, though, and the result probably won't look like a global proliferation of mini Dubais. But we need to acknowledge just how much we have to do to adapt our physical spaces to a world of higher temperatures. The cities of 2050 will be at least as different from 2021 as the cities of 2021 are from those of 1921. And of course, futuristic airships, because it wouldn't be a transformation scenario without the classic icon of a world reborn, the Cyber Zeppelin. Now, to be honest, in a post-pandemic world of high-speed wireless networks and commonplace remote work, the idea of slower airship travel doesn't actually sound too awful. Now, we'll be talking technology at more depth in the following hour, but one thing to recognize is that this isn't just a drop-in replacement of solar for coal or EVs for gas and diesel cars. There's a wide array of research into new photovoltaic technologies, for example, with transparent materials pushing us towards a world where there's no reason where physical surroundings can't be sources of energy. Every wall, every roof, every window or billboard that gets a bit of sunlight could be adding to the supply. Biotech, robotics, and myriad other technological systems we talk about all the time here will play their roles in making the overall system more resilient and able to withstand environmental hazards. These are just some of the tools and technologies already in development and production that can help us say no to the apocalypse. But is it enough? Many of you have been playing the foresight game long enough to immediately recognize that the technological transformations I just described, at the scale and speed we need, would be accompanied by a panoply of unintended consequences. Everything I just talked about would accelerate ongoing changes to jobs, housing, manufacturing, agriculture, and so much more. Just think of what this will do to oil and natural gas producing regions, both in terms of the loss of political and economic power and in terms of the loss of jobs. So much of this will be profoundly disruptive, especially on a compressed timeline. Saving the planet shouldn't mean making people suffer. So when we think transformation in the year 2050, we need to recognize that it must do more than just avoid an imminent catastrophe. It needs to give us the wherewithal to avoid the conditions and complexities that would allow the next catastrophe to happen, whether that next catastrophe is one of global pandemic or global violence or whatever. It needs to be a future of resilience. It needs to be able to withstand catastrophic forces, absorb them, and come back as strong as or stronger than before. The kind of transformation that gives us a 2050 worth living in is one that recognizes that we need to create transformative changes while remaining conscious of and able to respond to the unintended but sometimes inevitable harm that would arise from these changes. There's a common motto in Silicon Valley: move fast and break things. The problem with doing that is that this so often becomes move fast and break people. How do we make sure that this doesn't happen? So we started this by thinking in terms of scenarios. So let's go deeper with that particular tool. A standard method of crafting scenarios is to categorize the elements of the proposed futures, usually as society, technology, economy, environment, and politics. STEEP. Now, that last image is the Sarajevo airport tarmac. Consider this me placing Chekhov's gun on the mantle. STEEP doesn't represent isolated silos. These are framing devices. How do we think of this future from the perspective of, for example, how the mechanisms of political power and control change? We could reframe it then from the perspective of the kinds of impacts and changes we see in ecosystems or trade or networks. I want to highlight the developments in these different arenas, the changes that we would see in this successful transformation, in particular the ways we can create resilience in an uncertain world. Now, we already got technology out of the way a minute ago, so I'm going to toss out the conventional order, toss it all out the window, and start with environment. What we are doing with the environment in this 2050 transformation can be summed up as fixing the damage. Eliminating and reversing carbon emissions is the headline part, of course, but there's more to what's going on. There's a strong case to be made that the loss of biodiversity is a greater threat to the overall health of the planet than is global warming. The speed of disappearance of species around the world is enough to cause many scientists to refer to this as the sixth great extinction, the sixth time in Earth's geological history that a substantial portion of the world's life forms die out. Now, you're actually probably familiar with the fifth extinction. That was the one that knocked down the age of dinosaurs. By most estimates, this sixth great extinction will probably eliminate an even larger percentage of species. That's why stopping the sixth extinction is at the top of the list. Part of that process, but a big deal on its own, is reviving oceans, including hunting down plastics. Now, not only are the oceans carbon sinks, they absorb heat. The Earth would already be much warmer if the oceans weren't taking one for the team. And the oceans are the primary source of oxygen in our atmosphere. Yes, bigger than the Amazon rainforest. Now, that doesn't make deforestation irrelevant because reversing deforestation globally will be a big part of the carbon drawdown. Finally, managing water means figuring out how to make sure people and agriculture get sufficient water supplies without destroying the broader ecosystems and species that need water too. Jumping to the economy, the transformative process by 2050 can be seen as democratizing the system. Now, the elements you see listed here might seem to be a bit politically tinged, but I disagree. I like to think of this as, how would we want the world to work if we knew that our grandchildren and great-grandchildren would hold us personally responsible? In fact, that may be one of the unintended consequences of breakthrough in longevity. The people wealthy enough to get the first crack at life extension might actually live long enough to be held accountable for their actions by future generations. Few of these items should seem surprising. We can see that in many places around the world, not the US, but New Zealand, Canada, Japan, a number of others, that ongoing government support of income and healthcare has reduced the economic harm of the pandemic. This could well be an inflection point in our thinking about universal basic income and assets as elements of resilience in a time of crisis. Decentralized distributed systems are both a side effect of the current pandemic response and a core element of system resilience. It's harder to shatter something that's already in pieces. Get ready to hear a lot more about slack, defensive overproduction, and other processes and concepts that run counter to conventional wisdom about cutthroat efficiency and ultra-tight supply lines. Design for reincarnation is an emerging philosophy in sustainable business, emphasizing not just designing with ease of disassembly in mind, but designing with the knowledge that components and materials used must be able to have a productive life beyond the immediate object. Accountability and transparency are slowly becoming important elements of the business environment. How well can an organization's practices withstand scrutiny? Are its leaders truly held accountable for harmful policies and actions? And generational economics is just a label for the concept I suggested a few minutes ago. How would we want all of this to work if we had just as much stake as people in 2 or 3 generations from now? With politics, the 2050 transformation philosophy comes down to leading with the future in mind. This will largely be non-controversial in this audience, but probably a harder sell to broader economic and especially political actors. 3 policy shaping dynamics lead the list: evidence-based, foresight-based, and experiment-based policy. Although evidence-based decision-making can already be found in a number of institutions, it's still too easy to find examples of leaders making choices based not on evidence, but on ideology or personal preference. As a result, this is a field where misinformation and disinformation can create subtle but persistent long-term damage. Foresight-based policies are much less common in the political sphere than in the corporate world. Still, some early examples exist, mostly in small, vulnerable states like Dubai and Singapore. The last of these 3, experiment-based policy, is the hardest to find. It's a way for foresight and evidence-making policymaking to combine, deploying a test program in a controlled fashion, measuring the impact. We've actually seen a couple of tentative and very limited examples of universal basic income experiments. Although there are lots of ways for experiments to go badly, this could end up being a powerful method of determining optimal policy choices. Risk and horizon scanning generalizes the foresight-based policy a bit, moving beyond the process of creating laws and regulations and making it part of a broader decision-making across a spectrum of organizations and communities. For example, we could make foresight a part of the standard educational curriculum. And visible accountability parallels the element in the economy section, but is here to emphasize that political institutions, governance institutions, need to be as adamant about accepting responsibility for harm and making the responses public. In a highly chaotic world, the need for trust is paramount. We need to know that we can trust the systems we empower to act responsibly. Finally, we have the 2050 transformation in society. I put this last because in many ways it's the most critical. The overall philosophy is taking responsibility, but I mean that in a very particular way. It's taking responsibility for the consequences of what we have had to do to fight climate disaster. After what we've seen with the COVID-19 pandemic, there should be no doubt that support for mental health will be absolutely critical in the wake of the profound changes to the world that come from pushing back against global warming and its impacts. Some of the resulting stresses can be obvious, like loss of home, job, even country. But there will be profound disorientation arising from the speed and the breadth of the transformation. The spread of autonomous technologies will be frightening for some people, for example, and the revolution in the nature and role of employment could be confusing, even infuriating for people with deeply rooted beliefs in work and identity. We can't just assume people will adapt on their own. And this past year should be evidence enough that we need better models for monitoring the emergence and spread of pandemic disease. And this item becomes even more important when we broaden the use of pandemic to include mental and environmental health. Think of it as mesh epidemiology. There's overwhelming evidence of the society-wide benefits of educated and empowered women. Improvements in the quality of healthcare, the level of education for children, population management, and overall income can all be linked to some degree to improve social and economic status for women. Social diversity may seem like an odd, maybe even ideological inclusion in the list, but I mean it in a very straightforward way. Hybrid vigor. Monocultures are fragile, whether we're talking about stands of trees or technological standards. Societies with a diversity of thought, behavior, and cultural norms are ultimately societies better able to withstand the shock of the new and unfamiliar. Finally, risk mitigation. And that's really what all of this is about. A 2050 transformation will be redolent with potential harm, fear, and disruption, even if it's all in an effort to avoid a global calamity. The only way to make that necessary transformation survivable is to go in recognizing, but not accepting, that some people will not benefit from the changes underway. A successful 2050 transformation requires that we have ways to minimize the harm, calm the fear, cushion the disruption. A transformation that heads off climate disaster but leads to chaos and pain for billions is not a success, it's a nightmare. Changes across all of these issue areas, these steep, or I suppose here, TEEPS categories, hold some crucial similarities. They don't deny uncertainty, but seek to cushion it. Many of the consequences of the changes we make will be the unexpected, sometimes unwanted. We need to be ready to face surprises. They design for resilience and for change. They recognize that conditions and methods will evolve swiftly, even abruptly. And whether we're talking devices or philosophies, they can't be tethered to a moment that will soon pass. They experiment and learn from failure. Failure isn't something to be punished, it's something to be studied. Longtime technology analyst Esther Dyson offers a lovely aphorism: always make new mistakes. The danger of failure isn't in its appearance, it's in its repetition. They scan, prepare. Now, this is hardly a shocking revelation for most of you, I'm sure, but the key story here is that foresight can't be just a nice add-on. It needs to be embedded in our political, economic, and cultural practices. They think generationally, not quarterly. The consequences of our actions have repercussions that far outlast any immediate effects. The crisis we face now is the inevitable result of decades, even centuries, of leaving problems for the next generation to solve. That doesn't work in a rapidly changing world. They are, in short, ways to manage the chaos around us. I've been playing recently with the concept of polymorphic thinking, and it fits here. It's a way of connecting with the world that actively seeks out and adapts rapidly to new information and input. It's more than just flexible. Flexible implies a form that can bend without breaking. Polymorphic implies a form that can reshape itself along with new forces when they arise. Polymorphic thinking asks us to re-examine our assumptions whenever we learn something new, to connect new information and insights into our philosophies, not to eliminate the old, but to offer a different perspective, to provide a safe platform for experiments with emerging ideas, to embrace evolution but be ready for revolution. Now, this is probably a big ask for most people, let alone most organizations. It demands that we put openness and foresight and experimentation, and most of all, resilience at the core of our actions and policies. We have to be ready and able to move past beliefs and practices that no longer match reality. We have to be willing to be accountable to the future. It's a big ask, but the age of the little ask is gone. All we have left now are the big asks. If we fail to make a transformation of this scale, what we face as a result wouldn't simply be collapse. It would be a world of desperation. So this picture on this slide is also from Sarajevo. During the siege of the city in the 1990s, Bosnians dug a tunnel beneath the tarmac of the Sarajevo airport I showed you earlier. And it ran more than a kilometer. It's maybe a meter and a half wide, meter and a half high, barely a meter wide. The wounded and the terrified could escape the city and supplies could be brought in. That's what desperation looks like. Outrageous acts done in the name of bare survival. And that's what we're trying to avoid. Our dangers are not isolated, they're mutually reinforcing. Transformation becomes possible when we recognize that our solutions must be mutually reinforcing too. So here's the shape of it. We know what to do to head off a global climate catastrophe. We know that we need to do it, but doing so fast enough to matter will be incredibly disruptive to the lives of everyone. In order to make the year 2050 a successful future, we need to transform not just our technologies, but our ability to support each other amidst chaos, and all in 30 years. This transformation into a successful future will almost certainly play out in ways that I've missed. But the point of a forecast, especially a forecast like this one, isn't to tell you what will happen, but to open your eyes to the possibility of what could happen. It will be a difficult, maybe even nearly impossible task. But just because something looks impossible doesn't mean that it's not worth trying. Thank you.